it was inexplicable, the idea that she had been murdered. How? Why? Who? Like, all of these things were things that I was struggling to even confront emotionally, but also just understanding.
But you're kissing your boyfriend.
Well, he kissed me because I was outside in that courtyard and I was standing there looking lost, and he felt bad for me.
Now, it's interesting that Amanda Knox says, I was standing there looking lost, not feeling lost.
And I was standing there looking lost, and he felt bad for me. He kept close to me and was just trying to comfort me, and there was nothing he could say to tell me that it was going to be all right. He just...
And quite a huge smile leaks out there when she says, say.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. And my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science.
La voce più autentica del vero crimine.
Now, we have almost completed our review of the Knox case. In fact, I've not only left Perugia, I'm no longer even in Italy. I'm on the island of Santorini in Greece, but we have 2 or 3 more boxes left to tick before we've completed our attempt to properly revisit this case. And actually, new news is out where the Kircher family have just responded to Knox being the executive producer of a new docuseries, which is all about her story, and we'll deal with that in the next episode. Now, though, what's definitely made this case tough to prosecute or even wrap our heads around is the prosecution's own theory that Knox, acting as a ringleader, attacked Meredith with 2 men and supposedly tried to force Meredith to, well, it's a word that rhymes with Tex, with one of them. It's a ridiculous theory, and it shows even the investigators couldn't quite put the puzzle together, and it wouldn't be the first time. The same thing happened in the McCann case, which happened just months earlier in the same year, and just a few countries down the road in terms of the same general area, Southern Europe. In the John Benet Ramsey case, 2 of the top detectives investigating that case, Thomas and Kolar, both armed with a treasure trove of evidence. You know, they were right in the thick of things. They weren't able to integrate all of that information into a cohesive theory either. Some people can do it, some can't. And in the Knox case, very few have been able to do this as well. Have you been able to figure out the Knox case? Who did what? What is the motive? What was really going on? Now, my approach has been less about trying to prosecute or prove the case against Knox than to ask whether there are any reasonable doubts about her version of events. And you can decide, certainly in this analysis, whether there's merit to the doubtfulness of the 5 fluttering red flags identified in this analysis, in this episode. And in the comments, please let me know if you think all of the flags have merit. That would be 5 out of 5, or none of them, or some of them. Also, feel free to add some of your own. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you have found the analysis I've done, also going to Italy and all the effort that's involved, if you've really appreciated that, now would be a good time to show your appreciation, especially if you've never done so before. You can hit the thanks button and let's get started. So as I said, in this analysis, we'll examine and evaluate issues in the timeline. And so let's start with red flag number 1. I found my roommate and called the police.
And we went back to my apartment, and I was already feeling very creeped out. I was like clutching to Raphael, and we were looking around, and we actually opened Philomena's door, and that's when we noticed the the window was broken. So I immediately thought, oh my God, there's been a break-in, and I started running around. I went into the other bedroom, which was Laura's. All I knew is it creeped me out, and so I went outside with Raphael, and thank goodness Raphael was there, because I wouldn't even know who to call. Like I just didn't. It's not 911 in Italy. It's 113, I think, or 112. Either way, like I didn't know. And a couple minutes after we are outside of the house, these two. Well, there's one that comes up, and then shortly afterward, there's another cop that comes up, and they're not in uniform. They're wearing regular clothes, and they say that they're there to look for Philomena. And I thought, Philomena? Okay, what's wrong with Philomena? And they were like, oh, no, we have Philomena's phone. And we have these two phones, and one of them belongs to Philomena. And so I thought, okay, well, Philomena is on her way, because I had called Philomena and asked her to come home, like her room was ransacked. And then I was like, so are you here for the call that we made? And they said, no. Well, okay, I wasn't saying this. Raphael was saying it for me, because that wasn't happening. And so we brought them into the house to show them that there had been a break-in.
Now, that is only a tiny fraction of the verbal diarrhea around when are you going to talk about Meredith and your concerns about her and what is actually going on with her. Knox goes into incredible detail literally about everything else and everyone else. But she apparently made a statement somewhere, and I have been trying to find it. I don't have access right here to her book, but she basically said somewhere, I found my roommate and called the police. I suppose one could argue that she effectively said something like that in her email to friends. But think about it. Isn't that the kind of statement you would expect in the situation? I found my roommate and called the police. And so if Knox had made that statement, we'd expect that statement to be true, right? Don't you think it's true? And if Knox had done that, had found Meredith and then called the police, then there would be no reason to suspect her, right? Now, interestingly, there are potentially two intertextual cases, or at least three scenarios to consider here. In the John Benet Ramsey case, did somebody find John Benet and call the police? No. In the Madeleine McCann case, did someone find Madeleine and call the police? No. In fact, in both those cases and in the Knox case, what is reported isn't someone being found, but something else. That there's a kidnapping, that someone has been taken, or that there's a break-in, which later appears to police to be staged. Now, if Knox did say these words, and if they aren't accurate, what is wrong with them? What is wrong with, I found my roommate and called the police? Well, for starters, the police were already at the house when Meredith was found. And the police that were called were the postal police, and they weren't called by Knox, they were called by someone else who found Meredith's stolen phone dumped in their garden. So the more correct statement would be, someone else found Meredith in my home and someone else called the police. And if that's the case, wouldn't you say, jeepers, wasn't Meredith your friend? Where were you? Why didn't you call the police? What were you doing? And so is that suspicious? Is that worthy of a fluttering red flag? Now, first off, let me just say that I would prefer to provide an exact source, a date and a context for where and when Knox said that. It might be in her book or in an interview or both. I do know in her email to friends she wrote, "This is how I found my roommate murdered." Well, she apparently was never in the room and wasn't even able to see in the room because she was in the kitchen. The fact is, at the time Meredith was discovered, when the door was kicked in, it was due to the efforts of others. Philomena's boyfriend Luca, if I recall, not Knox. And that brings us to red flag number 2. We decided to call the cops. Knox herself never called the cops. Her boyfriend called his sister, who's a policewoman, and she suggested they call the police. And this is an area that is very troublesome, very tricky, very slippery, but also interesting. It's that they seem to call the police either within moments of the postal police arriving or shortly before. Where there is no doubt whatsoever is that the police are alerted to Meredith's murder extremely late. So however you want to argue about this, Meredith is found extremely late following the crime, close to 1 p.m. And by this stage, Meredith had been dead likely for close to 15 or more hours. In that period of 15 or more hours, Amanda Knox had been in that villa. I'm trying to think how many times it is. Is it twice or 3 times? But let's take it as twice. She'd been in the villa twice. And at one point, quite a lot earlier than 1 p.m. So why did she not call then? And so in her email, she says, it was then that we decided to call the cops. Now, in Knox's book, I think she describes the police driving by the villa, trying to find it, but this certainly creates an interesting scenario of them calling the police potentially after seeing them on their way, because what would it look like if they are there, they are on site, there's a dead body in the house, and they didn't call the police? Knox would later go into CNN and say, and I played this clip right at the beginning, I'll play it again.
It was inexplicable, the idea that she had been murdered. How? Why? Who? Like, all of these things were things that I was struggling to even confront emotionally, but also just understanding.
But you're kissing your boyfriend.
And then she says, well, it was because I looked lost. Wasn't it because she felt lost? The thing where she says it was inexplicable, the idea that she had been murdered, play that a couple of times. I don't know how well you know Amanda Knox, but to me that sounds like something she rehearsed, something she was prepared for the question and she rehearsed the answer. Anyway, and then Philomena quickly grew worried when she couldn't get hold of Meredith. Now that's a very interesting dynamic to compare, is compare Amanda Knox's behavior around the same situation to another woman, Philomena. How does Philomena react? How quickly does she do things? How quickly does she make decisions? How quickly does she act? Right? And when Philomena couldn't get hold of Meredith, and she hasn't even been at the house the whole weekend, Knox has, right? Philomena's getting indirect information from Knox, and she's quickly getting worried. It's almost like Knox is calling Philomena and saying, how should I react? What should I do? What should I think? Almost like Patsy Ramsey calling 911 and saying, we don't really know, we've got a kidnapping, but we don't really know what to do. Can you tell us? And John Ramsey carrying Jean-Benet up to the lounge and saying, can you tell me what's going on here? Because I can't. It's sort of passing it over to somebody else. And so with Philomena, worry quickly turns to panic when she learns that there was blood on the bathroom mat. And it was Philomena's boyfriend, or possibly the boyfriend's friend, but one of the two, that kicked down Meredith's door. So it wasn't that inexplicable given the situation. What was inexplicable was how long Knox seemed to take to figure anything out or to do anything, given that she was the first person on the scene and that she actually lived there. Why is she seemingly the last to know? How and why didn't she notice for hour upon hour that something was wrong with her own housemate, Meredith? And so this is Amanda Knox's account, emailed to friends. I'll provide a link to it in the description. You can read the whole thing. And you can't claim that it's unreliable due to duress. You can't say that she was coerced to say it or to write what she wrote, because she voluntarily sent it to friends. It's one of her first accounts. But ask yourself, is she saying, or isn't she saying effectively, I found my roommate and called the police? Okay, red flag number 3. Now she's sleeping in. Now, a very good way to cross-check not only this case, but also the Madeleine McCann case is, what was the checking system the day before the incident, and the day before that, and the day before that, and the day before that. In other words, what pattern is established, and then you cross-reference that pattern, if there is one, and supposedly there was, with a pattern on the day of the incident. And so what Knox is saying is that she slept late on the day of the incident. And then you've got to ask, did she habitually sleep late? Was she a late sleeper? Now, it sort of makes sense that Knox and Solicitor only called the cops close to 1 p.m. if it's true, if both of them did sleep late on the morning of November 2nd. And it's common cause that both Knox and Solicitor claimed they'd slept late. That's something they both agree on. They both say they slept until 10 a.m. But here's the problem. There are at least 3 issues with this account. Firstly, a witness claimed he saw Knox at his shop before 8 a.m. What was she buying? What did she need? And he said that he remembered her from her vivid blue eyes. And there was a guy called Quintavale. He said that Knox had appeared in his small shop at 7:45 in the morning. Secondly, activity on Solicitor's computer appeared to show someone up very early, that the computer was up and awake and activated. That was even before 6 a.m. And that person was listening to an American playlist. Songs on that playlist included Stealing Fat, Breed, Come As You Are, that's an REM song, In Bloom, Lithium, Smells Like Teen Spirit, It's My Life, Prelude, Songbird, Little by Little, Don't Look Back in Anger, Sleeping Awake, Jan Johnson, Flesh. And I mean, you can Google all of them and listen to them. And I mean, look at the times that these songs are playing. 5:44 a.m., 5:46 a.m., 5:49 a.m., 5:52 a.m., 5:57, 6:06. And I think there are a couple of songs that are skipped here. 6:11, 6:13, 6:18. Who do you think was listening to this music at this time on Solicitor's computer? And what was this person's state of mind listening to it? Thirdly, if Solicitor also slept soundly until 10 a.m. that morning, how was he able to take a call from his father an hour earlier? Because we know at around 9 a.m. Solicitor's father calls his son. So how does that happen? How does that work? Knox also appeared to be in a pattern of waking up early, which is something Solicitor noted in his book, and it appeared to be something that irritated him and possibly others who shared space with Knox as well. In Knox's own account in her email to friends, she describes going from Solicitor's home to her villa, carrying a plastic bag with dirty clothes. Those are her words. I took a plastic bag to bring back dirty clothes to go back to my house. Elsewhere, she describes taking a mop from the villa to Solicitor's home to mop up his kitchen floor. Apparently, a pipe broke and they needed to do plumbing, or mopping up, and I guess some plumbing. If we want to speculate, then of course it's possible Knox could also have been disposing of bloodied clothing by carrying them from one residence to another in a plastic bag, or for that matter, carrying bleach or other cleaning materials in a plastic bag. All we know is she said she carried something in a plastic bag. What was in it? Why was she carrying it from one residence to another? I mean, when last did you carry dirty clothes in a plastic bag from one person's house to another? Where you walked as well, let alone on the morning someone is found murdered in one of those homes. Red flag number 4, the call made to Meredith Lloyd's bank account. This is really so important, and it's so often forgotten about. It's probably the biggest red flag, because when it comes to the timeline, there's a set of mysterious attempts to link to Meredith Lloyd's bank at around 10 past 10 that night. And this raises the critical question about time of death. And think about, there's the staging of a break-in and a burglary, right? And also we can see that there was an attempt to steal Meredith's money. And it does actually look like Meredith's cash that she had with her was stolen. And so the real question is, was Meredith already dead at this point? Was Meredith trying to access her own bank account moments before she was murdered? Or was someone else trying to do that? Perhaps even while she was alive, trying to force her to give the PIN code or whatever it was at knife point. Was someone trying to steal her money, and a lot of her money, or was Meredith unsuccessfully trying to access her own account, which makes sense? And so it's something to consider. Did Rudy Gaudet force Meredith's ATM PIN number from her prior to killing her? Did he want her to call her bank to transfer funds? Did somebody else want that? I guess the question is whether this ties up at all with Knox using drugs and her withdrawing large amounts of cash at the time, or whether it ties up with Rudy Gaudet, who was also guilty of petty theft, and he was a sort of a petty drug dealer as well in the weeks leading up to the incident. Who is more likely to try to commit a relatively complicated murder, like trying, to get money via someone's cell phone, and who would even know to do that? Red flag number 5, Knox's version doesn't agree with Solicito's. So let's say you think all of this is a lot of nonsense. Amanda Knox is innocent, and obviously Celeste is innocent as well. Well, then why don't their versions of events agree with one another? You'd think that that would be very, very simple. Why can't they just stick to the same story? Most people are aware that Celeste seemingly withdrew his alibi for Knox at the Questura. And you might say, well, he did that because he was under duress. It was just a few days after Meredith's murder. He did it under pressure. Few realize that Celeste did the same thing several years later. He refused to provide Knox with an alibi. Think about that. Now, why would he do that? If she did have an alibi, and if they're both innocent, why would he not provide her with an alibi? Why wouldn't their stories be consistent? Years after the fact, when he's under no pressure, certainly not direct pressure from the police questioning him. Of course, he was under pressure in terms of he was appealing his conviction, right? And so he was under that kind of pressure to come up with a legal defense that's going to stick, that's going to work. So during the long drawn-out court cases where both Knox and Celeste were convicted, then both acquitted, then both convicted again, Celeste used this strategy of separating himself from Knox again as late as 2014, 7 years after the incident and 10 years ago from where we are now. This is while the case was still being tested, still facing kind of legal tests. And so at a press conference in Rome, according to one article, he told reporters that day, right, that he was unable to say where Knox had been during the early part of the evening on the 1st of November 2007 in Perugia. That's the night Meredith was murdered. Celeste had previously said that they were smoking marijuana that night and that it fogged his memory. But his new defense appears to place more emphasis on his doubts about Knox's whereabouts. And he said, I'm not here to change my story. Only a crazy person would do that. But then he said as well, I'm not a guarantor of Amanda Knox. I am Raffaele Solicito. And so the article goes on to say the 30-year-old has been gradually distancing himself from Knox as he prepares a last-ditch defense before Italy's top appeals court. Well, I see we had almost 24 minutes. I really want to wrap up here. There are other issues too, such as the cops finding the washing machine still on and still warm and containing a full load of Meredith's clothing. Remember, Meredith herself was found not wearing any clothes. So where was the clothing she was wearing at the time? It should also be noted that Meredith died ultimately of, do you know what? Do you know how Meredith died and why? She died of asphyxia, meaning that she suffered 2 extremely serious wounds from 2 different knives on 2 different sides of the opposite sides of her throat. And guess what? She didn't die of those wounds, as serious as they were. She drowned. And so the final point I want to make before we move on to the final phase of this review is to talk about this idea that drug use doesn't lead to violence. We've just dealt with this in a 15-year-old, Carly Gregg, who coolly and calmly shot her own biological mother to death and then was completely unemotional afterwards. Addiction, especially to certain drugs, can and does turn people into heartless psychopaths, especially when they feel someone close to them is spoiling their fun. The question is, did that happen here in this case? Does that make sense? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.